The scripture reading for this morning's sermon comes from 1 Samuel 24, 1 through 7, and this is page 200 in the ESV Story Bible. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day in which the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.' Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. This is the word of the Lord.
Alrighty, good morning everybody. It's great to be here, have an opportunity to share a little bit about what God's put on my heart from this passage. I'm excited, and I hope you all are excited to learn and from God's Word. Let's start by praying, and we'll dig in. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to study your Word, to learn more about you, who you are. I pray that this would be a time where we are confronted with ourselves, that you would reveal who we are, really, and that in light of who you are, we would be changed. I pray that in your name. Amen. So from a young age, I've kind of always wanted to be a hero. Confession. I always wanted, like, once I'm gone, I want to be remembered from... Should I re-switch in? All right. Take this off. Hello? Oh, is that better? Okay. As I was saying, from a young age, I've kind of always wanted to be, like, remembered. I wanted to leave a legacy. Like, maybe I had saved someone, or maybe I'd taken out the bad guy, so, people remembered me later. So I remember after September 11, I was a young teenager, and I would imagine President Bush, he'd start recruiting. He would need a young spy to infiltrate bin Laden's terrorist training camps. And so the idea would be you'd kind of like work up the ranks and then eventually be able to take him out. And so I was like ready as a young teenager for that role. I honestly remember like imagining that could be me. I hope I get the shot. So I don't know if it's because I'm kind of like a little bit of a megalomaniac that I had those thoughts, or I just like have a heightened sense of justice. I'm going to go with that one. But anyways, I know I'm not completely alone in this kind of way of thinking, because it seems like every month or every couple of months there's a new superhero movie that comes out, like all the time nowadays. And in these movies, the superhero, they go above and beyond to claim justice for the city, right? Sometimes they go above and beyond the law, go where the cops can't go, where the justice system can't go, so that they can right the wrongs in society. And in these movies and in these shows, there's always this recurring question. Is it okay? Like, can the superhero do this? Do they have the right to do this? Is it okay that they go beyond the law? And then there's this more basic question of when the justice system is not doing its job, right? When things are not going right, does a person have the right? Is it okay to take justice into your own hands? And the past week or so, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've realized that a lot of times, maybe not the very question, but at least these themes are something that they're kind of like, I'm subconsciously dwelling on these things. I mean, with big issues, the big picture things like human trafficking, like racism, ISIS, things like that, we all know we're not going to be able to change the world and, fix those injustices. Right? We know God has to move in order for something to happen. We admit that. Not many of us think we're going to be able to end those problems. But with the smaller things, the personal injustices in our lives that we can confront, I don't know. I think our tendency, and when I say our, I definitely mean my tendency, I think it's different. I think when I'm personally treated unjustly, my first step is to try to make it right, to fix the problem, to retaliate, or to create my own type of justice. So, for example, a dumb little example, when I'm driving down the highway and someone starts tailgating me, instead of getting over, I'll just drive a little slower, right? And just let them know, hey, you know what? I don't like what you're doing. I don't think that's safe. Or at work, like, my boss maybe would say something I don't like, or treats me or a coworker, unfairly, or gives me more work, or doesn't like my work, or whatever. My tendency is to kind of rebel a little bit and, try to, stick it to them a little bit. That's where I go. I don't know, what your tendency is. Maybe it's to get frustrated, or to get bitter, or to complain against the injustices. But I really think this question of what do we do when we face unfair treatment, I think it's something that we all deal with a lot more than we maybe consciously think about it. And today we're back in 1 Samuel, and we're going to see that David had this same question. He had been treated unjustly, and he had a chance, he had an opportunity to make things right. So the question is, what should he do? What should he do in the face of this injustice and in this opportunity to make things right? So we're going to walk through this story, and there are going to be 3 sections. The first is going to be the opportunity for justice, which is the section that we just read. And then we're going to look at the outcry for justice, and then the outcome of justice. And my goal through this sermon is that God would challenge us. That he would challenge us to be the type of people that rather than taking justice into our own hands, that we would be the type of people that let God be the judge. That we let him be the avenger of the innocent. That's my goal. And that instead of taking justice into our own hands, we would seek justice through submission to God's will and love. So that's kind of where we're going. But in order to get there, I think we kind of have to do a little recap of the story of 1 Samuel, just to really get into the story. So if we remember, this is probably several months ago now, 1 Samuel 8. You don't have to turn there, but Israel does not have a king. They want to have a king because they've been in this for a long time. They've been in this cycle where they'll have a judge, and then the judge will die, and then they'll turn away from God and be oppressed, and then they'll cry out to God, and God will give them a judge and deliver them, and it's just this vicious cycle where it keeps going on and on. And they're like, okay, enough. We need to stop this. We need a king. And we want a king like all of the other nations. So God says, all right, we'll do it. And he finds this guy, Saul, who happens to be really tall, happens to be handsome. Turns out he's good in battle. He's like the perfect fit for king. You compare him to all the other kings around, and he is perfect. But unfortunately, things start going downhill pretty quickly, if you remember throughout the story. First, there's 3 at least situations where he really fails. First, he's going to go in battle, I believe it's against the Philistines, and Samuel the prophet says, do not offer a sacrifice till I get there. Wait for me. I'll be there in 7 days. And Saul's waiting and waiting, and the 7th day comes, and he's starting to get really worried, and Samuel's not showing up, so he's like, all right, whatever, we're doing it. Offers the sacrifice, and just as he's finishing, Samuel arrives. That was a big mistake. And then he kind of starts making these rash decisions. They're in battle, and he's like, no one can eat anything until we win this battle. And that's generally not a good idea if you're going to try to be like running and fighting and things like that. You need sustenance. But he's kind of going a little crazy. And then the last straw, God gives him a direct command. to carry out God's judgment on the Amalekites, he's supposed to wipe out everybody. But he doesn't do it. He's afraid of the people, of his army. He's afraid what they might say, what they might do. So he doesn't fulfill God's command. And at that point, God says, all right, Saul, I've had enough. You're done. You're not going to be king anymore. I'm going to find a king after my own heart. And so the next step is God finds this king. And this man after God's own heart just happens to be this young shepherd boy, the youngest son of 8, a very unlikely candidate. So it's David. And Samuel goes and anoints David, and he is going to become the next king. And very quickly, David becomes really popular. He, in a battle against the Philistines again, there's this guy Goliath, who I'm sure we've all heard of many times. And David defeats Goliath, and everyone starts chanting and cheering, and they make up a song about how he has killed so many people. He becomes super famous. Everyone loves him, which is awesome, except that Saul doesn't like it because he's the king, and David's getting more press than he is. So Saul becomes extremely jealous and decides to get rid of David. So he, in the next several chapters, he really puts his creative energies to use, and he finds multiple ways to try to kill David. First, David's a master harp player. So he plays the harp for Saul, and Saul picks up a spear and throws it at him and tries to kill him. And that doesn't work. And then he tries to use David's daughter, or David's wife, which just happens to be Saul's daughter, as bait. And that doesn't work. He escapes, though. And after that, Saul gathers up the national army to chase down David and murder him. And this chase leaves this massive trail of blood. Just a couple chapters ago, chapter 22, Saul kills 85 priests and an entire village with men, women, children, and animals. He wipes them out because one priest from that village had helped David. So at this point, we have Saul, this crazy, bloodthirsty guy that has almost killed David multiple times. And if we had read like the whole story in one day, at this point you'd be like, okay, David's going to die soon. There's no chance that he is escaping. It's just a matter of time before he's done. And then we get to 1 Samuel 24. That's the whole backdrop for this story. And we're going to look first at the opportunity for justice here. So Saul has just finished taking care of a national threat, the Philistines again, and he's right back at David's throat. David barely gets a breather. So Saul gathers up an army of 3,000 men, which just happens to be 5 times as many as David has. And he has informants that tell him more or less where David is. So he goes out, and he gets right about where David is, and he takes a cave stop, and he has to go answer the call of nature. So he goes into the cave and does his business. And this is where the irony, the providential irony begins. It's amazing to read this story slowly, like a bunch of times, and see how God works this all out and how the narrator kind of puts it in here for us to just see the contrast between David and Saul and how all of Saul's plan are just turned on their head. So I'm going to point out 3 ironies because I think they're very interesting and kind of show us who Saul is and who David is. So Saul has gathered, I said, this massive army, right? 3,000 men. But the first time he's actually like in contact with David, he's all alone. All alone. His army is not there. And then if you look back at 1 Samuel 23:7, Saul is convinced that God has given David into his hand. But in this story, it's very clear that God has given Saul into David's hand. And then my favorite irony, Saul has been chasing David. He's been on David's tail for a long time. But in this story, David is literally lurking behind Saul with a sword ready to take him out. And Saul's completely oblivious to this. He's just squatting there doing his business. So this definitely seems like it is David's chance. It's his opportunity So the question is, what do we do? Right? David and his men have to answer the question. We've been faced with this injustice. Our opportunity is now. What do we do? And so I've read this story a bunch of times. When I was younger, I liked to read through like 1st and 2nd Samuel and these books because there's a lot of action. So it was always interesting. I'd get bored with other books as a teenager, so I go back to this one. So I've read it a lot of times, and it's taken me, even this week, just a bunch of times to finally kind of get in the story and actually be in David's shoes and like be in that cave with Saul right there. And I think it's because we live in a society that's so sanitized that we can't really relate a lot of times. Like, and this is a good thing, but most of us in our daily lives, we're so far from death, like any type of death, which again is a good thing in most of the time. But in this case, it's a disservice because it's hard to like imagine killing Saul. I think. I mean, when I read through the story, I'm like, I wouldn't have killed him, even though he's a bad guy. It's like I'm not a killer. So, but we need to question that. A couple weeks ago, something that kind of made me see this. I was driving back from Detroit from the airport, dropping some friends off, and all of a sudden, this massive animal walks out in front of me, and boom! I hit it, and killed it. I really actually felt pretty bad. I was like, I hadn't like killed anything in a long time, besides like a mosquito, and we don't even have those half the year. So I really felt bad. And the other thing, I was like, what in the world was that? Have you guys seen Princess Bride? Yeah. So I was like, that is an ROUS, right? It is a rodent of unusual size. No, actually, it was an opossum, but I hadn't seen one, so. Anyways, I killed it, and I felt really bad because I don't have that much experience killing things. So once again, it's just hard to think that I would be there in the cave and actually think about killing Saul. But we really need to try to get there. So I'm going to just lay out some facts about Saul to try to make us make a good decision here. As a group, we can try to figure out what we would do. All right, so here's a couple facts. First, David has a promise from God. It's a promise that says, you will be king. So in order for that promise from God to be fulfilled, Saul has to die. It is going to happen. It has to happen at some point. There's no other way around it. That's the first one. Second one, David's men who know this promise, they clearly see this as a God-given opportunity to kill Saul, to take a step towards the fulfillment of that promise. Right? They're like, this is God doing this. Do you not see? This is probably God's will. You need to kill him. And then we get into the character of Saul, right? He is a mass murderer. He's killed so many innocent lives. He deserves to die. And then fourth, if you really think about it, David would be acting in self-defense. He would be acting in self-defense. The trajectory of the story is, if something doesn't happen, David's going to die. He's going to be killed. Later on in the story, David is so sure that he's dead that for the second time, he runs to the Philistines to try to escape. And that would be like running to ISIS to try to escape. Do you know how many times I've already mentioned the Philistines, that they were fighting against the Israelites? Their worst enemy at that point. So David's sure he's going to die. So in a sense, it's like self-defense. If I don't do it, he's going to kill me. So what should David do? That's the question. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. Everyone in their right mind would kill Saul. That's what everyone would do. And if you're like reading this when it was written, you're like, he's dead. He's got to kill him. In fact, later on in the story, Saul agrees that if the roles had been switched, Saul would have done away with David. It's David's opportunity to grab justice by the horns and right the wrongs, make the bad guy pay, and to actually take a step towards the fulfillment of God's promise. So David, what does he do? He creeps up. He's behind them in the cave. He creeps up. He cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. And the next thing he's going to do is kill him. But then look at verse 5. Partway through verse 5, it says, David's heart struck him. And then verse 6. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed. So he stops, and he doesn't do it. Then Saul gets up and goes out without David touching him. This is very surprising. It is a crazy turn of events because David has definitely been treated unjustly, but he decides not to take justice into his own hands. He decides not to take a shortcut to the fulfillment of the promise that God made to him. And the reason that he gives is that Saul is David's anointed one. To be anointed basically means selected or chosen by God. So that means that an attack against the anointed, the one that God selected, would be like an attack against God. That's how David saw it. And when I was studying this, it really struck me because the word for anointed one is Messiah. Messiah, the word that we know and associate with Jesus. So think about that for a second. David calls this crazy, bloodthirsty guy Saul, he says he is the Lord's Messiah. He says it 3 times in this story. And that's why he doesn't kill him. He doesn't dare touch Saul because he does not dare rebel against God. That's how much he respects Saul and respects, really, God. And what makes the matter more interesting here, and it's kind of one last twist of irony, David is also the anointed one. He's been anointed by Samuel as well. But Saul's number one purpose in life at this point is to kill David, to kill the anointed one. It's another contrast between Saul and David. And I have a quick side note. It's not the main point here, but I feel like, especially in an election year, I just need to mention this because it is David's respect for the anointed leader. It just is, I think, needs to be mentioned. He respects God's appointed leader to such a degree that he doesn't do what anyone else would do. And just some food for thought. According to Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, there's no such thing as a leader that's not appointed by God. So if someone is in power, it's because God has allowed them to be in that position. So a question for me and for all of us really is, are we accordingly respectful in the way that we treat and talk about our leaders? Or because we disagree on policy or lifestyle or just personality, do we justify slander and disrespect? I think I need to think about this and just meditate on that. It's not the main point, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it is important to realize. But let's go on to the next section. So let's look at David's outcry for justice, and that is in verses 8 through 15. So let's read that together. It says, "Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, 'My lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there's no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked come wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. So that's David's plea, his cry for justice. And this plea actually has 2 parts. The first part is David basically saying, I'm innocent. And the second part is him turning to God and looking to God for vindication. So first, David's innocence. So his fear with David was that
David was going to usurp his throne through some type of military coup. And part of that was unfounded and just probably the result of Saul's paranoia. But in some sense, he wasn't completely crazy. David was super popular, right? Everyone loved him. And he had been anointed to be king after Saul. So the people, if the people had heard this, if they found out, and somehow Saul had found out, so probably a lot of people knew this, then they would probably get behind David, and he could very easily gather up a bunch of people and rebel against Saul. In fact, later in I think it's 2 Samuel, 2 of David's sons rebel against David and try to usurp his throne. So although Saul is paranoid and he's crazy, he does have some reason to fear. But what David pleads, what he says, and what he shows is that he is not a usurper. He is not going to revolt. He is innocent. So he says, Saul, look at this, man. God gave me the golden opportunity. I could have killed you, and no one would have ever known. We would have left your body there. No one would have ever found you. But I didn't. And not only did I not kill you, I actually defended you because some of my guys wanted to kill you, and I told them not to. And then he pulls out the robe, the corner of the robe that he had cut off, and he says, look how close I had to be to you. Like, it would have been so easy for me to kill you, but I didn't do it. So he proves he is not rebelling against Saul. He is not a usurper. He's innocent. And the second part of David's plea is amazing to me. Because what he does is he calls God as a witness and says, let God choose between me, between you, say who's right and who's wrong. And it's amazing to me because pretty much every conflict I've ever been a part of, and this may or may not be true for you, but for me, every conflict pretty much that I've been a part of has been a two-sided conflict, right? And by that I mean both parties are to blame, at least to some degree. And so I'm thinking like particularly in conflict with my wife, right? My first step is to start defending myself, defending my actions, saying why I'm justified and she's to blame, why I'm right and she's wrong, right? I don't need a judge. I don't need God to judge anything because I can see all of her faults very clearly, right? I don't know if that's how your arguments go, but that's where I often go. But this conflict is not two-sided at all. Not at all. There's a psychotic killer and there's an innocent man. But David doesn't go there. He doesn't go attacking Saul. Instead, he defers to God, both with his words and in the execution of justice. So rather than verbally attacking Saul, he actually starts self-deprecating. He says, what am I? I'm just a dead dog. And back then, they didn't like dogs. They're not like an Israelite's best friend. That's an insult. And a dead dog is obviously like a bad thing. He's like, I'm nothing. I'm a flea. Like, what? You're wasting your time with me. I'm not important. And then once again, he turns to God and says, all right, God, you be the one to vindicate me. You bring justice. And look at verse 15 one more time. May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. So rather than taking justice into his own hands, David calls God to do justice. And his portion of the fight, what he does, is he just submits to God's will. He knows, it's very clear that killing Saul would be against God's will. It would be a violation of God's will. So that's out of the question. So instead, what he does is he chooses to rest and to trust that God will fulfill his promise. He also fights for justice through love, through returning good for evil, and then trusting that God will right the wrongs. And this for me, this is where I am just personally very challenged. Because when I am treated unjustly, when someone insults me, or I feel like I've been treated wrongly, I want justice right away. And the best way to get justice right away is to take it, to make it happen. So I used to be a basketball player, And when you play basketball, things get heated often. And I would never start a fight, never. But if I got hit, which happened multiple times, I would not back down. I would not hold back. So I wouldn't start it, but I would end it. And my wife would get mad at me sometimes. But I want justice. I don't like being insulted. I don't like being disrespected or being hit or whatever. I was talking with a coworker just this past week and about past job experiences that she had had that were not very good. And she worked at this place where her supervisor and her supervisor's supervisor, they were just like mean. And every day they mistreated her and for no reason at all, just dumb, mean things. They made her feel insignificant and insecure and useless. And it was bad. I was just appalled. And every story, she told me multiple stories, I just kept getting angrier and angrier. And I was just like thinking of all the comebacks I would have had, how I would have stuck it to them, how I would have not allowed that to happen. And I was just like, oh my goodness, wow, I really need this story. I really need to hear about David and Saul, because I'm the type of person that wants to make justice, that wants to become the avenger. I don't know about you guys. I don't know what your reaction is to injustice, but that's what I do. So what do you do? How do you respond to injustice? Quickly, I want to look at the outcome of justice, and then we'll bring it home. The outcome of justice in verses 16 through 22. So let's read those verses. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared to me this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So this part's pretty straightforward. It's an incredibly eye-opening moment for Saul. Right? First, it seems that he recognizes the hideous nature of what he's doing, and so he just starts weeping. And then he recognizes that David is innocent. And not just innocent, he recognizes that David is a good guy. Like, Saul's just amazed that he's still alive, that David didn't kill him. And then Saul recognizes that David's destiny, the very thing that Saul has been fighting to stop, that's going to happen. And there's nothing he can do about it. And he says, "David, I know it. You're going to be king, and you're going to be successful, unlike me." And then he has just this one little request. "Please do not kill my entire family." And it's kind of crazy to us, but that's actually a legitimate request, because generally when a different dynasty started, the previous dynasty would get wiped out. And that happened in Israel's history often later. And so David honors the request, grants the request, and then they both go their way. Saul goes home, and David is not so sure how sincere Saul is, so he does not go home. Which ends up being a good thing. And there's only one thing that I want to point out here. And it's that Saul preemptively accepts God's verdict. David appeals to God, and Saul says, "You know what, David, you're right. God, I know what he's going to do. He's going to carry out a just judgment. I'm the wrong party here." He knows that God has already issued the final statement on Saul's rule. And this is amazing, because Saul shows that he knows God. He knows that God is the just judge. He knows that God is the avenger of the innocent. And it's revealing to me because Saul is the villain of the story. He's the bad guy. But he gets it. He gets God. He knows. And finally, it's like he actually trusts God for the first time. He's like, I trust that God is going to fulfill his promise to you, which means my line's going to be done. So it's revealing because the bad guy gets it. Do I get it? Do we get it? Do you get it? Do you get God? Are you able to trust that God is the just judge? That he is the avenger of the innocent? Do you know God in that way? Are you convinced that that's who God is? To close, I just want to bring this home and kind of get at what it means for us. And at first glance, it seems like what this means for us is we just have to follow David's example and we'll be all right. And for the most part, in the story of 1 Samuel, that's correct. Right? He's a pretty good guy. For the most part, we'll be pretty safe if we do that. But by the end of the story, his flaws really do start coming out. And by the end of the story, we'd all become adulterers and murderers if we just follow David's example. So that's not the way to go, obviously. This is the first of 3 successive stories where David has an opportunity he's been treated unjustly, and then he has an opportunity to respond by taking justice into his own hands. This is the first of 3. And in the first 2 stories, this one and the next one, he doesn't stop himself because of something inside of him. It's not him that stops. It takes outside intervention to get him to stop from taking justice into his own hands. So here in verse 5, it says that this crazy phrase, his heart strikes him. God stopped him. God moved in his heart to say, you can't do this. Don't kill Saul. In the next story, David is literally, him and his men have strapped on their swords and they're marching to kill this guy because a guy insulted David. And the only reason he stops is because the man's wife comes out and says, please don't do it. So my point is, David is not the ultimate example to follow. He's not the guy we're supposed to whatever he does, I'm doing. But he does point us in the right direction. He points us to God the Father in his speech. That's where we go. He says, God is a just judge, and I can trust him. And then with his life, he points to Jesus. In many ways, David's life is parallel to Jesus' life. So just a couple things. They both were God's anointed. They both were destined to be kings, but they had to face crazy injustices along the way. They both were presented with shortcuts to the throne. So this was David's shortcut, right? All he had to do was kill Saul. There'd be a vacuum of leadership, and he could jump in and become king. Jesus also had an opportunity to do that. When he was fasting in the desert for 40 days. And after that, the devil comes and starts tempting him. And he says, all right, I'll give you all of the kingdoms in the world. All you have to do is bow down and worship me. And I think it's very easy for us to be like, Jesus is God. It was not difficult at all for him. But no, he had not eaten for 40 days. It was difficult for him to say, no, I will not do that. He refused to take a shortcut to glory. There's also a parallel. They both could have taken justice into their own hands. David, we've seen that. But think about Jesus, right? He's taken to court because, in large part, just because the religious leaders are jealous of who he is. And then they bring out these false witnesses that start slandering against him and saying all these lies just so that he is condemned. And then he's beaten and they spit in his face just because. And then worst of all, he's nailed to the cross. He's executed naked as a criminal when he's done nothing wrong at all. And rather than retaliate in anger, right? Rather than condemn the people, rather than take justice into his own hand, he prayed for his tormentors. He said, God, please forgive them. Jesus deferred to his Father for justice. And his portion of the fight the fight for justice, was submission to God's will, was resting and trusting that God would do what he said he would. His portion was love for his enemies, which took him to the cross. And he trusted that God would bring justice, that he would avenge the innocent. I think often the reason that we demand our rights, that we demand immediate justice, or that we get frustrated and bitter and start complaining about injustices is really because we don't believe that God will administer justice. We're afraid that the other person's going to get away with being a bad person, with treating us wrong, and they're not going to have to pay. So I know my reaction. I know what I do. I want to enforce justice. What is your reaction? How do you respond? And then what does your reaction say about who you think God is? What does your reaction say about what you think Jesus' death on the cross was? It definitely says a lot of times in my life that I don't believe that God is a good judge. I don't believe that he's going to bring justice. I think my reaction says that I don't think that Jesus' death on the cross was enough to pay for that injustice done against me. I don't think it was enough. I think I have to add a little bit to that. See, as Christians, we have this golden opportunity because we live in a world that yearns for justice, just yearns for justice, but there's no ultimate judge. There's 7 billion, individual judges. We live in a world where everyone wants fairness, everyone wants justice, but we can't even define the terms. We can't agree on what that means. So our opportunity, it's not to define justice for the rest of the world. Our opportunity is to point to the just judge, to defer to him, to let him be the avenger of the innocent, and then to seek justice by submitting to his will and loving others. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I know this is difficult to imagine doing a lot of the time. It's counter often to who we are, to our way of life. We want to demand our rights and to be treated fairly. But I pray that you would help us to, rather than taking things into our own hands, to rest in you, to trust you as in you as the good judge, the just judge, and that you would allow us to love others, even those that treat us wrongly. That you would help us to submit to your will, even when it's difficult and we don't want to. I pray this in your name. Amen.